예, 오늘 그 펠로우 포럼에는 러시아 혁명 100주년을 기념한다는 취지에서 초이 채터지 교수를 모셨습니다. 초이 채터지는 중견 러시아 혁명 혹은 러시아사 연구자로 미국에서 지금 한 50대, 40대 후반에서 한 50대 후반까지 아주 가장 왕성하게 공부하고 활동하는 러시아 혁명사 연구자입니다. 뿐만 아니라 제가 한양대학에 있을 때 리드했던 그 마스 디케이터십 프로젝트에도 참여해왔고, 이번에 팔그레이브 핸드북 마스 디케이터십에도 역시 한 쪽지를 써주셨고, 이래저래 저희하고는 상당히 오랜 기간 동안 같이 컬래버레이션을 해왔던 그런데 이번에 사실은 러시아 혁명 100주년 여기 서울에서만 기념한 게 아니니까 너무 바빠갖고 정신없이 왔던 시카고에서 바로 아마 지금 있는 것은 저기 로스앤젤레스 캘리포니아 스테이트 유니버시티 로스앤젤레스에서 갈 수 있는데 휴스턴 등등등등 다녀왔고, 이번에 Wider Arc of Russian Revolution이라고 해서 러시아 혁명 100주년을 기념해갖고 미국 영미권의 러시아 혁명 혹은 러시아사 연구자들이 이제 시리즈 책을 냈는데, Wider Arc of Revolution이라는 건 러시아 혁명이 더 넓은 영역으로 퍼져갔다. 그러니까 이른바 제3세계, 아시아, 중남미 지역에서 러시아 혁명이 어떻게 전파됐고 어떻게 받아들여지는가에 대한 책을 3권짜리를 편집하고 있습니다. 뿐만 아니라 최근에는 Russia in the Wrong 20th Century: Contested Voices, Memories and Perspectives라는 책을 같이 편집을 했고, 2015년에는 Everyday Life in Russia: Past and Present를 편집했습니다. 또 2012년에는 Russian Experience: Americans Encountering the Enigma 해서 러시아를 여행했던 미국의 작가들이라든가 이런 이들의 그 러시아 여행기를 가지고, 특히 저는 제일 재밌게 읽었던 건 랭스턴 휴즈가 센트럴 에이지아를 방문했을 때 이 미국의 아프리칸 아메리칸들이 미국에서 겪었던 경험과 센트럴 에이지아에서의 소련 혁명 이후의 중앙아시아인들이 랭스턴 휴즈에 대해서 얘기했던 진짜 판타스틱한 그런, 난 랭스턴 휴즈가 소련을 방문했던 줄도 몰랐는데 그 방문기 아주 흥미로운 그 방문기에 대한 그런 쓴 바가 있고, 원래 여성사로 출발을 했습니다. 원래는 Celebrating Women, Gender Festival Culture and Bolshevik Ideology가 원래 본인의 첫 번째 혼자 쓴 북이고, 현재는 블룸스베리 프레스에서 Russia in World History, a Transnational Approach, 그래서 세계사 속의 러시아, 트랜스내셔널한 어프로치에 대한 그런 책을 쓰고 있고, 또 저희 아직까지 여기 서강대학에는 안 왔던 것 같은데 카렌 페트로네라는 우리도 같이 공유하는 그 친구와 더불어서 글로벌 1991, 소련 붕괴했던 1991년을 글로벌한 그런 시각에서 분석하는 책을 카렌 페트로네와 현재 같이 쓰고 있습니다. 그래서 어떻게 보면 현재 가장 왕성한 러시아 혁명 혹은 러시아사에 대한 트랜스내셔널 히스토리, 글로벌 히스토리를 연구하는 가장 왕성한 그런 연구자라고 합니다. 오늘 아침에 사실은 바로 몇 가지 컨퍼런스 다니고 오늘 아침에 도착했는데 그래도 잘 쉬고 왔다고 해서 괜찮습니다. 우선 따뜻한 박수로 맞이합니다.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. And I want to thank Ji-Hoon Lin, who sort of set new standards in studying world history. And I come from a very backward field of Russian history. And Russian history was studied during the Cold War as something very different, something so out of the norm, something so aberrational. And that was my graduate training. I started school, my PhD in 1988 in the United States, and Russia, Soviet Union was the enemy, and that was how I was taught to study it. The good thing about leaving school is you can forget everything you were taught, and that's when the real learning starts, when you start thinking for yourself, because universities, schools are also a little bit instruments of propaganda. And I want you to feel empowered to take everything that you hear with a grain of salt, right? There's a lot of, universities are very elitist, and they propagate a certain kind of worldview, which can be very useful for the nation state, useful for the military, and I think as historians we can play an important role in life. So this project, so firstly, it is so wonderful for me to be here, and secondly, it's once in a lifetime a historian gets to celebrate the centenary, right? And I'm just happy to be alive, to be celebrating the centenary. But it's also a little bittersweet because all my colleagues in Russia are not celebrating the centenary, right? It's a forbidden subject in Russia, not forbidden, but the Putin government has put very clear parameters on how 1917 can be remembered. They're not at all anxious that it should be remembered. All they want to talk about is World War II, because World War II, everybody can come together and say this was a great moment. 1917 is very divisive. 1917 also has this alternative script, right? So 1917 isn't just about Lenin and Stalin. 1917 is also about Mayakovsky. It's also about Pyotr Kropotkin. It's also a little bit about Tolstoy. It's about Emma Goldman. It's about Alexander Kollontai. It's about these many powerful political voices that were stopped in Russia that I think have real relevance for the 21st century. And so the Putin government is very smart. So they have this one narrative. 1917 was disorder, and the disorder came to an end, right? And that is how Putin has marketed himself. He's not claiming to be the best or the smartest or the brightest, but he's saying, if I go, chaos will follow, right? And Russians are very afraid of chaos because they've lived through some terrible times after 1991. And so what we are trying to do is, by bringing Russia back into world history, there are two things that I've tried to do in my work. One is to do away with this Cold War narrative of modern world history is divided between Western liberalism, democracy, and Soviet oppression, because I don't think that narrative quite works. And today the talk that I will give you, and I'm going to take you on a little detour. A detour of two rather irrelevant men of the Russian Revolution, and I've picked them to make a historiographical point. Sometimes the view from the center is not the best historical view. It might be politically useful, it might be useful in class terms, it might be good for the nation, but it can be very bad history, right? And so what is the job of the historian? Is our job to support the structures of power, or is our job to be a good global citizen of the world, right? And I take this ethical job of the historian as seriously as being a good historian, going to the archives, checking your sources. I think we have a larger role to play in world history. And so I'm going to take you for a tour of the way these two men, and M.N. Roy to the right, he was very interesting because he started off as a revolutionary in India. He decided to go to Germany because the German government was going to give them money and guns to get the British out. And then he went to the United States, Stanford University, where he learned about Marxism and radicalism.
At Stanford?
At Stanford, with this young Marxist American woman, and he'd never read Marxism before. And then he goes to Mexico, and then he starts the Mexican Communist Party with Borodin, and then he goes to Russia, right? So it's a real detour, right? And Tagore, the Russians had loved him because Ivan Bunin had translated some of his writings. And they kept trying to get him to come because he was a big deal, he was a Nobel laureate, but he somehow just couldn't go. And then he finally went in 1930 for a very short period of time, but he wrote a memoir, right? So I'm going to take these two little bit irrelevant men to the Russian Revolution and tell you a much longer story about why the Russian Revolution matters, okay? Now, in many ways, 1917 was a hyper-local event, right? What happened in 1917 was not important. This was happening all across Europe, right? During the First World War, the food supplies were stretched. The soldiers were mutinying everywhere, in France including, right? So 1917 was a very local event, but it became a global event, right? And even the USA, saved from much of the destruction of the First World War, during this period was seeing this monumental upsurge in labor radicalism. Military defeats and demobilized soldiers added to the heady mix of hate, hunger, and resentment, and it brought down the Romanov, the Ottoman, the Hohenzollern, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So 4 big empires fell during this time. The initial victories of the left in European capitals were only short-lived. It was only in Russia that the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin and Trotsky, held on to power through a bloody civil war and withstood the armed interventions mounted by Germany, the US, UK, Japan, and France. In the long run, and I forgot to add Czechoslovakia, in the long run, the local events of October 1917 turned out to have true global significance, which is why we're still talking about it today. Observers across the world, depending on their political beliefs, reacted either with excitement or horror, right? As the Bolsheviks instituted the first socialist society and economy in world history. They repudiated capitalism, a system of economic production and social organization that had grown exponentially during the 19th century. Bolsheviks had argued that the accumulation of private property was fundamentally unfair, and this is very important, capitalism as a mode of production with its inbuilt cycles of booms and busts, right, which is sort of, in your short lifetime, some of you have experienced the recession of 2008, right, that was a global phenomenon. And they said that this was highly inefficient. It's sort of odd, right? Socialism thinking capitalism is inefficient because capitalism has always argued that socialism is inefficient. They nationalized banks, transportation systems, factories, agricultural estates, and began investing modestly in the fields of education, health, culture, labor, and women's rights. During the first decades of the Soviet revolutionary experiments in culture, society, and economics mesmerized the world, right? So everybody who was anybody went to the Soviet Union. From 1917 to 1991, despite travel restrictions and real incredible poverty in the Soviet Union, they hosted millions of visitors. So I've worked on the Vox archives, and it is quite incredible, the people who were coming to Russia, who wanted to come to Russia, and why they wanted to come to Russia. Revolutionaries came looking for funding, journalists came for the scoop of their lifetime, and capitalists came begging for mining concessions and contracts to build socialist factories. So much of the construction in the 1930s under Stalin, if you look at the firms that were involved, they were German and American firms, right? Both countries in deep depression, and the Soviet government was paying gold, right? Because no one wanted the ruble, they were paying in gold. Depression eras came, hundreds and thousands of workers came from the US alone. And academics came looking for proof to either validate or discredit the Soviet political system. In the West, expertise about the Soviet Union could lead to lucrative and high-profile careers in politics, in universities, and in print journalism. And if you look at FDR's cabinet, right, I'm sorry, not FDR, Roosevelt's cabinet in the 1930s, including the State Department, almost all these people had some experience in Russia, right? And so that was the ticket. I think now knowledge about China is going to be that same currency in the 21st century. Russia was it in the 20th century. Now the Bolshevik project was shaped by intense competition with the West, right, from day one. And the Soviet Union sought to influence notable Western intellectuals, artists, policymakers, and academics. And since 1991, there's been a lot of archival revelation about the money that flowed from Moscow to various policymakers in the West. Now, there has been so much scholarship about Russia from the West that there's this whole body of literature which I am now calling Russia under Westernites, right? So the Russian Empire, since Peter the Great, became that other European empire that also had Asian ambitions, right? So it was directly in conflict with the British Empire and the Ottoman Empire for almost 3 centuries. And so Russia had to be contained both discursively and militarily. And a lot of that literature about Russia tended to be about Russia's backward, Russia's not a democracy, Russia's an autocracy, blah, 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 blah. Now the interesting thing is, because of this very large body of literature. When I started getting interested in Russia in world history, the first book that I did was Russia and America, because if you look at much of the writing of the 20th century, British, French, German, lesser extent, but 75% of the literature is generated from the United States. And so after I did that, I started thinking, well, this is very interesting. How about other people who went to Russia, right? Or how was Russia received in other parts of the world? So even my intellectual trajectory was pretty typical. And so 100 years after the revolution of 1917, we have very little information about non-Western travelers to the Soviet Union. So Elizabeth McGuire just published a book, I don't know if some of you have read it, on the Sino-Soviet romance, and she looks at the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a very interesting book. But really, we really know very little about what they thought. So the intellectual profile of the colonial visitor, right, resists the categorization within the well-known trope of naive enthusiasts or disillusioned gold warriors. So Western travelers tended to go through the cycle, right? So they came from the left, they went to Soviet Union with great idealism, they stayed there for a while, and then they came back and said, no, the system sucks, the West is much better, right? So there's the cycle of how the Western visitors. But the colonial visitor, their attitude to the Soviet Union was very different, right? And I'm trying to tease out intellectually how can we categorize this, right? How can we create a model that's comparable to this Western model of enthusiasm and disillusionment? So Rabindranath Tagore, poet, Nobel laureate, and M.N. Roy, nationalist, global revolutionary, and self-proclaimed radical humanist, and this was his theory that he came to the end of his life, also unsettles the fiction of the bipolar world, which has dominated so much of the 20th century, right? The world divided between, you're either within the Soviet sphere of influence or you're in the US sphere of influence, and there's really no other way to think about 20th century history. And I think when we look at colonial visitors, another kind of argument begins to emerge. In this, in my presentation, I will argue that Roy and Tagore looked for new vistas of global democracy, right? And that was beyond the templates of Soviet socialism and Western imperial liberalism, because of course these are from British India, where their idea of the West is not, of course, democracy and capitalism, but of colonialism, right? So it's another prism to understand history. And their political writings offer us a crucial vantage to rethink the structure of Cold War history, and more importantly for me, to chart a new map of global freedom, of political freedom in the 21st century. Now, Tagore's visit to the Soviet Union was scripted and stage managed as befitting a global celebrity. Moscow loved to bring in high-powered people and, and have them say wonderful things, right? I mean, that was their modus operandi. Roy fled from Moscow in 1927 after the Soviet foreign policy debacle in China that brought Chiang Kai-shek to power. Tagore's vast corpus of literature was translated and celebrated in the Soviet Union, while Roy became a persona non grata, and it's very interesting. In all the archival data, they never say M.N. Roy, they say Renegade Roy, right? So it's always Renegade Roy. Tagore's literary legacy is always invoked at Indo-Russian diplomatic events, and there's a statue of him in the Park of Friendship in Moscow. Roy's penetrating treatise, on the other hand, The Russian Revolution, has been accorded no critical attention, right? It's like he never wrote the book. Roy, hardcore revolutionary, was deeply contemptuous of Tagore, right? And so it's very interesting, when I started this project, a lot of people said, why are you putting these two men together, right? I mean, Roy thought Tagore was all that was wrong with the world, right? Tagore's communist nephew, Rabindranath Tagore, was a bitter rival to Roy in Indian leftist circles and probably conveyed his negative impressions about him to his influential uncle. But in a curious way, by the end of their life, the world poet and the world revolutionary came to remarkably similar conclusions about the nature of freedom and unfreedom. And I'm using the word unfreedom deliberately. The roots of authoritarianism and the role that every individual must play in the accumulation of power, right? To prevent the accumulation of power in any context, liberal or authoritarian, right? Because of structuralism, we tend to understand modern history as political structures, and I'm going to argue that no, I think we little people play a role in these structures, and I think we all bear some ethical responsibility. Roy and Tagore's political ideas were incubated in the conditions of British colonialism, and subsequently filtered through their Soviet experiences, has the power to subvert the powerful framing of the 20th century as a world divided between the free West and an unfree East, of a world forced to choose between two options of capitalist or socialist modernity. The former representing parliamentary democracy, civil liberties, free markets, and the latter encoding party control of society and the economy. As time progressed and the Soviet oppression grew more manifest during the Great Terror, self-proclaimed European and US leftists, well-known writers such as George Orwell, Richard Wright, Arthur Koestler, Stephen Spender, Louis Fisher, André Gide, Langston Hughes, many others disavowed their commitment to communism in dramatic acts of public repentance, right? This was the whole God that failed literature. They became important crusaders in the fight for freedom and democracy. And their literature form is very important in the 20th century contest between liberalism and totalitarianism. Isaiah Berlin's brilliant writings about negative freedom, Hannah Arendt's idea about civil society, Karl Popper's advocacy of an open society, Friedrich Hayek's diatribes against government intervention in markets leading to the road to serfdom, all these became intellectually so powerful. So after the collapse of 1991, people have really used these ideas to create the world of globalization and neoliberalism. And these were supplemented by discourses on moral and inner freedom as a means of authentic resistance to authoritarianism created by famous East European dissidents such as Anna Akhmatova, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, some of you might have read, Czeslaw Milosz, Boris Pasternak, Andrei Sakharov, Václav Havel, and many others. During this time when this narrative was beginning to take place, right, of freedom and unfreedom, right, which is still a very powerful narrative, millions of subjects laboring in the invisible empires of democratic Western nations, right? It was always England, never the British Empire. It was always France, never the French Empire. It was always the Netherlands, never the Dutch Empire, right? So this dichotomy, and this is the good thing is when you have empires far away, no one pays attention. The Soviet Union was a contiguous empire. The European empires were oceanic empires, right? And this physical space allowed them to pretend we are democratic at home and authoritarian abroad, right? Whereas for Russia, they're authoritarian everywhere, right? So geography plays a very important role in imperialism. And they were bemused, confused, and even outraged by the sophisticated deployment of an imperial and Orwellian doublespeak on liberty and freedom, one that allowed the repressive French, Dutch, and British empires to seize the mantle of freedom under an oppressive Soviet Union. Under millions of colonial eyes, Soviet oppression made manifest through enforced labor, confiscation of private property, suppression of intellectual and political freedom was very reminiscent, right? It reminded them of what was happening at home. So in 1934, Tagore writes, unfortunately for us, the one visible relationship of Europe with Asia is that of exploitation. In other words, its origins are commercial and material. There is no people in the whole of Asia today which does not look upon Europe with fear or suspicion. When the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, the mighty British Empire stretched from islands in the Caribbean to significant parts of South and East Africa, from special mandate territories in the Middle East, right? That was brand new empire that they got after the First World War, to outright colonial possessions in Asia and the Indian Ocean. British businessmen ruthlessly extracted labor, material, and environmental resources in plantation mines and factories in India, and this is very important, assisted by an Indian bourgeoisie and a bureaucratic elite that did very well under colonial rule, right? So when we think about colonial rule, it's not only resistance, it's also collaboration. Colonialism is only possible because of collaboration. There is no colonial power in the world that has prospered by force alone, right? The British administrators met colonial claims for democratic self-governance and free markets with violence and incarceration, using native troops, native policemen, native bureaucrats to suppress demands for freedom. And this is the same history of the French colonies in Asia and Africa, Dutch Empire in Indonesia, which was actually the worst, right? And the US possessions in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and Philippines, right? I mean, so the pattern doesn't really change. Given this historical context, for the colonized, the most revolutionary act of the Bolshevik government didn't care so much about private property. But the first thing that Lenin did was he published the treaties that were signed during the First World War about how to grab more territory in the world, right? Both Lenin and Trotsky agreed that the colonies in Asia and Africa should have the right to self-determination. So Lenin's argument in his widely read Imperialism, the high stage of capitalism, which is as relevant today as it was in 1917, that the First World War was nothing more than a capitalist scramble for markets worldwide, for resources, and cheap labor to offset falling rate of profits at home. This critique rang true to hundreds and millions of people around the world. The Marxist understanding of colonialism as enabling the success of capitalism, right? And this is not Lenin, this is Marx, right? So Lenin is borrowing from Marx. Enabling the success of capitalism in Western Europe by providing cheap labor, raw materials, markets, and capital from taxation carried considerable explanatory power. And even today, much of post-colonial theory and world systems approach is based on this intellectual trajectory. Lenin's critique of imperialism became even more important during the peace negotiations in Europe after the German collapse, when it became very clear to everybody that Woodrow Wilson's ideas about national self-determination was only going to be applied to Eastern Europe, right? So this was not going to be applied anywhere else. It was only going to be applied in Eastern Europe. And to the former territories of the Romanov, Hohenzollern, Ottoman, and the Austro-Hungarian empires. The countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were considered to be too backward to receive either independence or nationhood. Much of the modern Middle East was detached from Ottoman control, and large areas were granted to the French and the British under the mandate system, right? And so the Sykes-Picot Agreement, basically what had governed the Middle East for at least 1 century, is now unraveling, right? And but you see, it's still the Sykes-Picot system. Colonies in Asia and Africa were aghast that their cries for national independence were not even discussed at the Paris Peace Conference. And some of you may know Ho Chi Minh was there, right? And Ho Chi Minh had so hoped to meet Woodrow Wilson because he was so fired up by his 14 points, but he wasn't invited to the table. US support for an exploitative European colonialism worldwide forced many towards the Soviet Union. So this is important. So many people, Ho Chi Minh looked to the Soviet Union not because he loved the Soviet Union, but because he couldn't get a deal from the United States, right? And the same story with Fidel Castro, right? And the same story over and over again, that so many nationalists were forced into the Soviet orbit because the US supported European colonialism. Okay. Now, and the Comintern then played a very limited role. You know, when you read the Comintern papers, you realize how utterly inept they were. And they really weren't the smartest people on the block, right? But they were just lucky that people were so fed up with the West that people were coming to them. But what they did was they provided an ideology of anti-colonialism, right? So it wasn't the money, it wasn't the guns, because frankly, the Soviet Union didn't have either money or guns. But what they did have was this ideology of anti-colonialism, right? And ideas are perhaps the most powerful weapon in any war. So Eamon Roy, as I said, had been sent to Germany. He was trying to get to Germany, but he couldn't get to Germany. He came to the US instead, where he was radicalized at Stanford and Berkeley, right? His coterie included Evelyn Trent, a young radical, this young American woman who was extremely well read in Marxism, and she was going to travel with him to the Soviet Union. Interestingly enough, there's so little writing about her, and she seems to be, someone's looking for a master's thesis. I really want somebody to work on it with Brent. I don't have the time myself. Roy, in the US, Roy sort of gave up his very narrow-minded Indian nationalism and sort of became this global cosmopolitan, right? And that was going to be his identity. When the US administration cracked down on Indian revolutionaries, because there were quite a few of them on the West Coast, all the way from British Columbia down to San Diego, he fled to Mexico, but he got a letter from the president of Stanford, David Starr Jordan, who was a pacifist, very much on the left. And he took a letter to the president of Mexico. And then he goes to Mexico, and there's a whole bunch of Americans, expatriates in Mexico called the Slackers. These were people who didn't want to be drafted into the First World War, very left group. And and everyone's there, right? I mean, there's Tina Modotti, there's Frida Kahlo. This is a very exciting place for American intellectuals to be. And then from there, when he meets Barodin, in Mexico, Roy utilized the generous subsidies of the German government, which I think he gave to Barodin. I don't quite know. And then he learned more about Marxism. Now, Roy rose very quickly. Now, this is a transnational world, right? So we want to think in the 21st century we've created globalization, but really, I would say the Jesuits were the first globalizers, and then followed by the Comintern, right? Because the Comintern created this transnational global space, and that that a poor young man from India could travel in very freely, right? And if you map the travels of the people on the West, the Comintern opened up the world to them when people had very few other options to travel. Now, Roy had unshakable self-confidence, even though he changed his political views according to changing political context. However, his ability to change his mind based on evidence and reason proved anathema to many who believed that ideological consistency alone was the true hallmark of a revolutionary, right? So this man was a thinker. And thinkers weren't liked in the Soviet Union because Stalin wasn't much of a thinker and he didn't like people who thought too much. So he was invited to the Soviet Union at the behest of Barodin, and he famously challenged Lenin on his colonial thesis at the Second Congress of the Comintern held in Moscow in 1920. And why is Moscow holding this Congress? They're shattered by 3 years of intervention and civil war, but of course the first thing they do is they hold this global Congress. And Roy challenges Lenin, and Lenin and the Soviet leaders wanted to support national wars of independence as a way to destroy European capitalism, right, and to bring about proletarian revolution in the heart of Europe. It's saying that, wait a minute, if you support nationalism, you are supporting the bourgeoisie, the national bourgeoisie, right, and so you are actually helping the spread of transnational capitalism, right? And so this is what he clashed with Lenin, but he really admired Lenin deeply, deeply. He didn't like Stalin, but he really admired Lenin. In both India and China, Roy advocated that the Soviet Union should support and create decentralized workers and peasant movements rather than support independent movements, which we all know were completely hijacked in the aftermath. Mere freedom from British rule rather than social and economic revolution, Roy argued repeatedly, would actually strengthen the Indian bourgeoisie. Roy proved to be persuasive, and at the Second Comintern Congress of 1920, and this is where, Lenin is so confident that he can allow a young man from India to challenge him, right? And this is where poor Stalin, he is so lacking in confidence that he has to kill anybody who disagrees with him. And so both the theses were presented. Roy recreated himself in the highly authoritarian leader in the mold of the tough Bolsheviks. Everyone walked around in leather jackets and leather boots. And Roy got into that act, and he became a member of the Central Asian Bureau of the Comintern operating from Tashkent, because the Soviet Union were doing what the Russians had done, right? The Great Game. So they were trying to create these revolutionary networks from the Middle East to India, using Afghanistan as the conduit, right? I mean, it's not happenstance that we are still in Afghanistan, right? Everyone's been in Afghanistan in world history. That is the gateway to Asia, right? Roy contributed greatly to the formation of the Communist Party in India, and he was a member of the Presidium of the Comintern for 8 years, and was very active in Western Europe, especially in Berlin. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit Roy's time in China. And Roy, who had initially sided with Stalin in his fight against Trotsky and even voted for his expulsion, eventually came to disagree with Stalin's monumentally obtuse understanding of fascism, right? Because this is when Stalin comes up with saying, oh, our real enemies are the Social Democrats, right? And if we have to even cooperate with the fascists, that's okay, right? And that was really the stupidest thing that... I'm sorry. Okay. And so by 1928, Roy is on Stalin's hit list, and he gets out, he manages to get out because Bukharin and Louis Geisler, this German communist, helps him leave. And of course, he's expelled from the Comintern. Subsequently, Roy declared his open support for the Communist Party opposition in Berlin, working with members such as J. Lovestone, American, surprise, surprise. J. Lovestone is so important. August Thalheimer, Heinrich Brandler, and the latter two, it's important to know, are disciples of Rosa Luxemburg. And if you remember, Rosa Luxemburg is the first person to challenge Lenin's centralization, and and she's killed under very tragic circumstances, but her critique of 1917 is one of the earliest critiques of Leninist centralization. So Roy then argues that the undemocratic centralization in the communist movement under Soviet rather than international leadership would inevitably lead to terror. Roy then returned to it, so he gets out of Russia, goes to Berlin, goes to India, and interestingly enough, he's arrested in India and thrown into prison, right? So, I mean, what are the odds? And he was accused of conspiring to deprive the king emperor of his sovereignty in India. That was the formal charge that was laid against him, right? So he was sentenced without a trial for a 12-year term of imprisonment under conditions so terrible that even Einstein signed a letter, right? So there was an international campaign to free him. This man was so well known, saying that really you have to keep a man like this under these circumstances. Anyway, so he comes out of prison finally with 9 volumes of his prison writings and this beautiful memoir of a cat, right, which I love the most, right? So he used this time, but he came out in broken and in shattered health. So when he comes out, the Indian National Congress says, oh, maybe we can use him, right? This guy is a global celebrity. But Roy being Roy, he says, oh my God, Gandhi's control of the Indian National Congress is like Stalin's control of the Communist Party. Wasn't the best analogy to make at that point, right? And so in 1942, when Gandhi decides to launch Quit India movement, Roy is the sole voice because he knows fascism. He was in Berlin for years, right? He's saying, this is not the time to ask for freedom because we have to defeat fascism first, right? And that makes him very, very unpopular in India. Like, you're not a nationalist. He was never a nationalist. He never pretended to be a nationalist. Roy's inability to follow orders and independence of thought led him to what some people consider political wilderness and irrelevance. But I'm going to argue that this is when Roy is his most profound, and this is when he produces some of his best political writings, which for some reason nobody's ever looked at, which is good for me. Right? In 1937, he publishes his magnum opus, The Russian Revolution, and which he reissues in 1949. Anticipating that his work would be compared to Trotsky's infinitely better known history of the Russian Revolution, Roy critiques Trotsky's work as a masterpiece of imaginative literature, but of doubtful historical value. A gifted and prolific writer, Roy in many ways resembled Trotsky, which is why I still trying to figure out why he hated him so much. He talked about that Trotsky was a terrible egotist, and he said that Trotsky's achievement was only possible because of Lenin, right? He said when Lenin was around, Trotsky was able to function, but with Lenin gone, Trotsky could never be so great. They both agreed that the Russian Revolution, Trotsky said it should move to Western Europe, and his ideas of the permanent revolution, and Roy is saying, no, 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 Marxism has a much better chance in Asia and Africa and Latin America. Now, Roy's break with the Soviet Union happened twice. Once when Stalin comes to power, and the second time after the Second World War, when the Soviet Union colonizes Eastern Europe, right? And this is, for many, many Indian nationalists, was a terrible blow, right? Because they were drawn to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was the champion of anti-imperialism. And when Stalin started behaving like this imperial conquistador of Eastern Europe, right? And he started wearing his own military uniforms, Roy's like, I've had it. This isn't what I'm looking for. And then he starts thinking about, well, what kind of world do I want to live in, right? If the Soviet God has failed, and Western liberalism is really imperialism, what are some other ways to think about the future? So, so Roy uses a Marxist critique to say that parliamentary democracy was a powerful fiction that could disguise class interests only temporarily. But he started thinking about how can we make parliamentary democracy truly representative, right? Now, Roy argued that his Marxist training had led him to reject all dogma, whether on the right or the left, and that no political system was sacred, right? That was his takeaway, right? He said all political systems should be subjected to the same amount of scrutiny and not just accepted as the best possible system. And he argued that the existence of more than one political party or even elections did not guarantee that the system was democratic. So, for example, the Indian National Congress in India that dominated Indian politics for 50 years, he said this had not created a democratic system. So disillusioned with the two alternatives of liberalism and Stalinism, he then proposed a new philosophy that he called radical humanism. He drew from anarchist, syndicalist, religious, trade union, local movements of the global pre-Soviet left, exemplified by thinkers such as Tolstoy, Emma Goldman, Pyotr Kropotkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and a passionate believer in individual freedom. He said that both fascism and communism fell into the fallacy that great men, heroes, supermen, could and should represent the will of the people, right? And so he's really moving towards anarchism by the end of his life. Now, Roy returned to a consideration of grassroots democracy as a possible solution to modern politics. And he used the Russian model of the Soviet workers, of the Soviets or worker councils that had been developed in the Russian Revolution of 1905. Roy argued that the state had to be coterminous with society, not stand apart as an alien or occupying force, however well-intentioned or benevolent. Political representatives drawn from councils would represent their local electorates and their needs to the next level of government rather than work at the behest of the political parties who were tied to national or elite interests that had no local relevance. Roy believed that a global society could be built on the basis of these self-governing local councils. It was not mere happenstance that Trotsky, architect of the concept of the militarization of labor, also returned to the idea of workers' councils in his Revolution with Trade, which some of you might have read in 1937. Perhaps revolutionaries only return to democracy when they lose power. But even at the end of his life, Trotsky cannot think beyond the Leninist paradigm, right? So what is Trotsky saying? Replace Stalin with me and you'll have socialism, right? And what Lenin had famously updated Marxist thought by arguing that a small, disciplined party led by an indomitable leader could lead the proletarian class to power. Now, Roy came to the opposite conclusion. So he's saying that political parties and power-hungry leaders create conditions for unfreedom in the first place. And even the most qualified leader with the best intentions could not serve as a cure for political authoritarianism, right? So he's saying, get out of this mindset of the good leader, bad leader, right? Good system, bad system, right? And start thinking about how do we build a genuinely democratic society. And so Roy, contra Lenin, who had brilliantly theorized the road to power, argued that the desire for power and the capture of political power, whether through revolutionary or parliamentary means, created the original problem of modern politics, that is the loss of individual freedom. The condition of freedom was further exacerbated by the concentration of power in the hands of the few, whether in a dictatorship or in a democracy. But he believed that the capacity for freedom of thought of action was essentially a human characteristic, right? And ultimately human beings would rebel against any political institution that was designed to frustrate their desire for freedom and equality. A true leader should awaken the desire for freedom, reason, and radical self-government among their fellow beings. And through that process, render the political leader superfluous and irrelevant, right? So this is a completely different way of thinking about leadership. At the end of his life, Roy would argue with Tagore, and so Tagore says, "What in the West is called democracy can never be true in a society where greed grows uncontrolled, encouraged, even admired by the populace. In such an atmosphere, a constant struggle goes on among individuals to capture public organizations for the satisfaction of their own personal ambition. And democracy, I like this, becomes like an elephant whose one purpose in life is to give joy rides to the clever and the rich." Isn't that a nice definition? So then, how am I doing on time? 10 more minutes? 10 more minutes, okay. Oh, okay, I have some time, okay. So Roy barely escapes the Soviet Union with his life, right? And Tagore comes in 1930. And of course it's very interesting. So who comes with Tagore? Harry Timbers, this Quaker leftist American doctor who had spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in the 1920s doing relief work. He is Tagore's personal physician, and he accompanies Tagore to Moscow. And of course, he's treated there as a great celebrity, but it's very interesting. Tagore had this terrible habit of speaking very freely. So Stalin didn't meet him, right? And I was wondering, like, maybe Tagore might have said something to Stalin. Okay. Now, so Tagore's letters from Russia that were published in 1930, he ran into trouble everywhere, right? So when the letters were published, he was in the US after he came to Russia, they said, oh, here comes the greatest propagandist for the Soviet Union. In England, in the parliament, there was an inquiry. How on earth did you all allow this seditious piece to be published, right? So as soon as the British find out, they stop the publication. And then in Russia, they didn't like his letters either. And so what they did was they took out a few, they censored it and they published it only in 1956, right? So if you manage to upset 3 empires, I think you're doing something good, right? So I want to talk about a couple of things. So when Tagore goes to Russia, and this is very interesting, right? Whenever Western visitors go to Russia, the first thing they talk about is how poor Russia is, right? The public buildings are so run down, the streets, the poverty of the people are badly dressed. Tagore says something completely the opposite, right? And so he's saying that he took perverse pleasure in the absence of visible signs of wealth. Instead of reinforcing the trope of material poverty, right, which was widespread in Western writing, Tagore condemned the arrogance of wealth that is usually framed against the backdrop of muted but pervasive poverty in most capitalist cities, right? So he's saying the problem is wealth, the problem isn't poverty, right? It is because the distinction of wealth is non-existent that the visage of wealth has changed. And it is not the unseemliness of poverty, it is want. If nobody dressed well in Moscow, then Tagore said, that means there is no elite in Moscow, right? Proletarian and relatively egalitarian Moscow was a huge shock to Tagore, right? And look where he's coming from. He's coming from India, and he spent a lot of his time traveling in the West, and then many countries in Asia. He goes to Latin America. And of course, he's the son of a major landowning family in India, and he becomes very ashamed of his own parasitic status when he's in the Soviet Union. And in his letters from Russia, he's comparing the Soviet Union with the British government, right? And he's saying, so in the Soviet Union, in 10 years, I'm seeing these very confident, energetic young people. In India, after 160 years, I see this utterly demoralized and destroyed peasantry. And he talks about the fact that how obsequious Indians are and how confident Russians are. And he spends a lot of time with Central Asian students. So Tagore's political analysis was based by a colonial perspective of an impoverished peasant India that had been devastated by British policies of commercial agriculture. And of course, he is part of the problem, right? Because comes from a landowner class. And so he drew on a critique of wealth and capital accumulation, and his analysis comes from the Upanishads. And he gives a lecture at Oxford that year where he's talking about greed, right? And there's this injunction in the Upanishads, which is like the biblical injunction, do not covet, right? And in his Hibbert lectures, Tagore had elaborated on this concept of greed as the bane of the modern world, right? And he says when greed has its object, material gain, it can never end. This is like the lunatic chasing the horizon. And so he elaborates that both capitalism and colonialism comes about from an aggressive desire for material wealth, right? And he's saying that's at the basis of it. Now, Tagore he wasn't very well read in leftist theory, but he knew enough. And one of his very famous poems from 1895, he talks about how is capital formed, how is private property formed. And in the poem, he talks about this young peasant whose land is taken away. And then when later he comes back and he tries to pick a fruit from his own tree, he's branded a thief, right? So he gets it without setting marks. As a landowner, he understands the basis of private property right. Now, throughout his life, he believed that education was the perfect antidote to poverty. It was key to creating a democratic society. So when he goes to the Soviet Union, he's so excited by the fact that they are spending resources on education. But at the same time, he is also worried about the fact that the system of thought control that they are developing in the Soviet Union is also very bad, right? And he says, all is not perfect here. Briefly, the defect is that they have turned their system of education into a mold. If the theory of education does not correspond with the law of the living mind, either the mold will burst into pieces or man's mind will be paralyzed to death. And so when he comes back from the Soviet Union, he's managed to be in trouble on 3 continents, and he's thinking about fascism because he's also spent time in Germany. And he writes this very famous novella called 4 Chapters. And this novella has always been read as Tagore's attack on violent revolutionaries in India. So nobody likes that novella much, right? But I'm going to read this novella as a product of his experiences in the Soviet Union, right? Because when you read it through the frame of Russian literature, the characters seem to be drawn from Dostoevsky, from Chernyshevsky, from Ivan Turgenev, right? So it seems to be, and it's sort of odd. I talked about it with some of my Indian colleagues, and they were sort of surprised that, what's Russian about this plot? And I said, well, everything is Russian about the plot, right? And so in his novella, he has these 3 characters. One is Authoritarianism, he's running this tightly knit revolutionary cell, right? And then there's this other young man who's been brought in, and then this young girl, Ella, right? And she's the one who challenges him, and in the end she dies. She's killed under his orders, but she makes it very clear that her death is an act of, it's her own act, right? So, any of you read Kessler's Darkness at Noon? So it's a very, very, very famous novel from the Soviet Union, published in 1940, and in that, Arthur Kessler is Hungarian, and he goes on to live in England. He talks about the terror in Stalinist 30s, and he draws this whole notion that, people like Bukharin went willingly to their death because it was the last act they could perform for the revolution, right? That was very famous, right? And Tagore is saying exactly the opposite, right? So Ella's not dying because she wants to follow the orders of this idiot who's running the party, right? So she's dying out of defiance, right? So an ethical act of not submission to a cause, a leader, a party, but an ethical act of passionate disobedience to reclaim human freedom, right? And and this novel was very misunderstood in India because everyone thought that Tagore was attacking Indian nationalists. But what he was attacking was incipient authoritarianism, right? And he was saying, it doesn't matter if you're a nationalist and you're authoritarian. It doesn't matter if you're a liberal Democrat and you're authoritarian. It doesn't matter if you're a communist. So he's dealing with the notion of authoritarianism as a individual ethical dilemma. Okay. In his last interview conducted in Moscow with a reporter from Izvestia, that was only published in 1988, Tagore warned the Bolsheviks about the dangers of inculcating class hatred through political indoctrination and about propaganda. There must be disagreement where minds are allowed to be free. It would be an uninteresting but sterile world of mechanical regularity if all our opinions were forcibly made alike. Violence begets violence and blind stupidity, right? So Tagore believed that the quest for power was then analogous to the quest for wealth, right? And he wrote about the greed of unlimited power vitiates the mind. He would have agreed that the moderate acquisition of extreme wealth through the means of either capitalism or colonialism was a process similar to the concentration of power in Bolshevik Russia. And Tagore then has this whole idea about elite behavior, right? And he talks about the fact that we can and this is what Tolstoy said, that we can destroy an elite, but another elite will pop up in its place, right? And in one revolution we destroy an elite and then the same cycle happens. So he's saying, well, what if we redefine what it means to be an elite, right? What if the elite started behaving differently? Would we break and this is of course what Tolstoy is going to say 30 years ago. Tagore's antipathy to organized politics, political parties, leaders was rooted in an anarchist and even aristocratic resistance to all forms of authority. Roy, the more systematic political thinker of the two, came to a vision of radical democracy from his political experiences in British India and the Soviet Union. From very different political positions, they both realized that the single-minded pursuit of power and wealth was in and of itself a dangerous thing, and that these illiberal and anti-social desires were often nurtured and encouraged in liberal and socialist systems. Tagore refused to join a political party. He spent his time in social reform in the countryside. Roy refused to legitimize the democratic window dressing that the Indian National Congress provided to independent India after 1947. And he concluded that perhaps the best society would be a society in a leaderless world. So I'm going to conclude now that it's important to remember that the "got that fail" literature, right, that was used to frame and discredit socialism throughout the globe was developed in the heat of the Cold War. As such, it should be treated as a set of polemical discourses, not received as the tried and true wisdom from the winning side of history. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economics of free markets and the political philosophy of representative democracy has taken on canonical status worldwide, right? We have almost no alternatives. These intellectual ideas have been used to justify neoliberal policies and provide the philosophical underpinnings of contemporary globalization. Roy argued that to accept any unequal political system, whether liberal or authoritarianism, right? So now we're going back to the concepts of radical equality, is contrary to our capacity for reason and deforms our innate desire for freedom. Roy would add that our education should make us question wisdom, right? Not render us compliant and ineffectual in its assimilation. The universal, classless, and feminist visions spawned by the Bolshevik Revolution have ebbed 100 years later as we confront an unprecedented wave of fascist-tinged authoritarianism, ferocious inequality, environmental degradation, and political authoritarianism worldwide, right? We desperately need lineages of alternative thinking that lie beyond the orthodoxies of the right and the left, political visions that can nourish our faith in the egalitarian, sustainable, and democratic future. Thank you.
Thank you. Choi, do you know the first name of Couch Queen?
Carl.
No, Renegade.
Oh, Renegade.
but it was quite popular joke in Czech.
Renegade,
Because
yeah.
they always, Kautsky was always mentioned as renegade Kautsky.
Renegade
So
Kautsky, yeah.
people didn't know that Karl was his first name.
Same
Same Roy, yeah? Renegade Roy.
Renegade, yeah.
Okay, this is really, really interesting and very intriguing. A story of those two Indian nationalists, who were socialists, who were certain poets and thinkers, who had really different experiences in living in different countries, and it's really sort of global history of people's ways of perceiving the Russian Revolution and the Western democracy and nationalism, something like that. So it's a really, really intriguing story. So now I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. Who will be first? Who will be the first?
I seem to have stunned everybody into silence.
I have a question. I have a question, but you mentioned that this renegade Roy figure, he was unhappy with India. But what was his specific rationale behind it? What alternative? Why?
In India?
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm just curious.
You know, India's all, you know, world's greatest democracy, blah, 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 right? That's a story. But in reality, India was ruled by the Indian National Congress. And the Indian National Congress, you know, Gandhi, the day India became independent, he said, oh, our job is over. We should disband the Congress and go back to the villages where the real work begins, right? So Gandhi was very much, I think, an anarchist because he learns about anarchism in London from reading Tolstoy, right? I mean, think of global history, right? And when Gandhi says, oh, let's disband the Indian National Congress and go home, everyone's like, what, are you crazy? We just came to power, nobody's going home, right? So when Gandhi is assassinated in India, people are a little bit relieved, political powers, because this man truly had another vision of India, right? And so what Roy was saying is, just because we have elections and Congress is elected over and over again, that doesn't make India a democracy in any meaningful way, right? But at that point during the Cold War, Indian democracy was politically very useful, even though India was very allied to the Soviet Union. So David Engelman, his book is out, right? He's a professor. It's out, right?
Yeah.
So he's a professor at Brandeis, and he's written this wonderful study of how both the Russians and the Americans were courting India during the Cold War, right? But even today, if you hear some of the discourses, oh, Indian democracy versus Chinese authoritarianism, right? We have a very authoritarian government under Narendra Modi, right? It doesn't seem to be very democratic.
So thank you so much for your talk. I found your talk mind-blowing. Thank you so much. So you said that toward the end of Roy's political career, he turned to this idea of radical humanity with a strong anarchist color.
Right.
But by the time there were immense amount of critics against anarchism, right? So I wonder how
Yes.
he dealt with these existing critics about anarchism.
And you know, I'm going to go back to 1917, right? Because 1917 was as much an anarchist revolution as it was a Bolshevik revolution, right? And the Bolsheviks come to power by co-opting anarchist slogans, right? But what they do is very quickly after 1918, they turn against the anarchists, right? And then by 1921, with the attack on Kronstadt, pretty much the anarchists are either killed or in jail or thrown out. And it's really Emma Goldman who, the only one who has the courage to speak for anarchism, this Russian-American Jewish woman, her mind disillusionment in Russia. So anarchism was the alternative to Marxism. So if you read 19th century, it's not at all clear that Marxism is the only force. In fact, I would argue that anarchism is much more popular than Marxism, right? And so 1917 really represented the defeat of anarchism, not by capitalist democracy, but by Bolsheviks, right? So anarchism it's one of those forgotten histories, right? And it's made a huge resurgence in the world now, right? After almost a century of going underground, right? And so Roy never uses the term anarchist, but I am reading it into anarchism because the philosophy is entirely anarchist. So it's not that he's calling himself an anarchist.
There's one guy here who wrote a long essay on Emma Goldman 20 years ago.
Yeah, she's so important, right? She's one of the few voices. But again, you know what happens to people like her? She's thrown out of the United States and she's thrown out of the Soviet Union. So what happens when you say no to all structures of power? She becomes a stateless, homeless person going from country to country.
Other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, especially from the Chinese, native way of a modern Chinese literary person. Especially I find it fascinating the Roy's intellectual journey is exactly the opposite to general trend of Chinese intellectual journey. Because usually Chinese intellectuals, they started from radical anarchism, radical individualist anarchism. They were also scientific anarchism, like Peter Kropotkin was very important in Chinese anarchist history. So before 1921, when the Communist Party was established, anarchism was the major trend, as you pointed out. It was very popular, much more than communism. But they gradually moved to like a global revolution and then also nationalist revolution and then that direction. So it is really the opposite direction. So when I see this trend, I think it's because China is very, especially Maoist idea, is really based on real revolution theory. He had to do revolution, so it is like a new democracy.
Right.
So it is really based on materialist background in his mind. So I was wondering what was Roy's really like job? How did he make a living? So
Who?
is it Roy?
Roy, okay, okay.
Because that may be really interesting the aspect you may want to see as well. Because for me, he is very idealistic too.
Yes.
Anarchism can be idealist idea that what he had to doing was opposing the others and then even distancing from church, although he looked really similar to church.
Right.
And then that kind of thing was really created rather than involving in real politics and then the based on the making living and then that kind of requirement. He was very much free from all these material bases for me.
He wasn't free, right? So from initially, he grows up very poor in India, right? Then he has some German funding, right, which takes him to the United States and to Mexico. Then he's a paid member of the Comintern in 1928. And it's very interesting, if Roy had not been so outspoken, perhaps he would have done just fine. But as we know, Stalin got rid of almost the entire Indian Communist Party, as he did of many parties between 34 and 39. But Roy was just constitutionally incapable, I think, of listening to other people. And and then when he comes out from prison in India, Nehru, who's going to be the first Prime Minister of India, is there to receive him when he comes out of prison. So again, he had another chance of having a very nice, cushy sinecure, because the Indian National Congress would have loved to have had a speaker as charismatic and as well known as him, right? Again, he turns them down, right? So this man sort of every time he's close to power, he says no, right? And he never thinks about it till the end of his life, and he starts thinking, well, what does it mean to say no to power, right? Because we don't have any theories about that, right? We only have theories of people who successfully came to power, right? Mao, barrel of the gun, Lenin, vanguard of the party, right? And so, but we have no theories of what it means to say no to power, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at philosophically.
Well,
Yes.
Your lecture reminds me of many things. I have two questions. First of all, your lecture makes me happy because there is a lot of European intellectuals who have visited Russia after Russian Revolution. For example, André Gide from France. They have a little bit some critical viewpoint, but on the contrary, after first March movement of 1919 in Korea, there was many communists who went to Russia to learn about how to learn socialist countries after revolution. For example, Park Han-young, who is one of the founders of the Korean Communist Party, who passed some years in Moscow, he has left some writings on his impression of Russia, but I didn't found any traces of critical viewpoint on Russian Revolution. He followed the path of Russian Revolution. He followed the orders of commentary. But are there any other? Do you find any other intellectuals critical viewpoint of non-Western countries except India?
You know, and I'm sure they exist, and this is my ignorance, right? So I'm a historian of Russia, so this detour into India was very painful and long for me. I can't tell you how nervous I feel talking about Indian history. And so, and of course, and I was looking for people who fit my thesis, right? But most Indian communists were like the Korean communists, right? Who came to learn from Moscow about socialist modernization, right? I know Nehru also had mixed feelings, but he didn't really write about them. But I think these people were aberrational, right? But I wonder how many people thought like them and didn't actually bother to write. You know, not every revolutionary was also, I mean, they're both highly gifted writers.
Contrary to the Bang Ka-young, who is the communist leader, Syngman Lee, the first president of Korea, South Korea, he has been at all these anti-communist from the 1920s. He had passed many years in the United States. He witnessed how to work democracy. He has been all these anti-communist. It depends on where we learn, where we observe what happens. And his experience in the United States has been very important for his viewpoint.
But many American intellectuals who were initially very excited about the Soviet Union, right? There were many of them, right?
John Reed.
Yeah, John Reed. John Reed died there, right? But in the 30s, many of them, it was Stalinism that they couldn't deal with, right? And even George Kennan, right? The famous Kennan. I mean, even he loved Russia and he spoke Russian beautifully, and his problem was Stalinism. I mean, there are so many versions of Russia that could coexist.
There's many factors to decide one viewpoint, one worldview.
Absolutely.
Do you know how did the Chandra Subhas Bose think about Russia? Because we know that he fled to Russia, right, from the rest of by the British Empire. Then just after a short stay, he went to Italy,
Germany,
That's
right?
Germany, right? Then he came to invade Japan, and he became a sort of a propagandist of the great East Asian for prosperity zone. But he's still very much respected in Bengal among Bengal.
Roy thought he was an idiot. And so, I mean, there's this great move. There's this professor at Harvard who's written this big book about it.
His nephew.
Yeah,
Bose's nephew, right?
And I never quite got it because, I mean, to make a deal with fascism to save your country doesn't seem to be much of a deal, right? And so, but he's sort of this charismatic figure, but his political ideology is very shallow. I mean, it's all about Indian nationalism and Asianism. There's nothing profound about this. Yeah, so. But I'm one of the few Indians who also think that he wasn't. I'm going to get a little tea. But I can hear questions from other people have questions.
So other comments or questions?
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk very much as well. You described Roy a couple times as cosmopolitan, and I was wondering if he would ever sort of describe himself that way, and whether he wrote about cosmopolitanism in his political writings.
Cosmopolitanism is an elite phenomena, right? So, and he had many languages, and he was very well read. I think far better read in European literature than in Indian literature, right? He avoided cosmopolitanism because of its elite connotation, so that's why he called radical humanism, right? And so he was very much an Enlightenment thinker, of thinking that all humanity is governed by some laws. So he would totally agree with you, but he would hesitate to call himself, I think, a cosmopolitan. So.
But also on the other way around, this one Korean film critic invented the term of the subaltern cosmopolitanism. It means that the Koreans who are devoted from Vladivostok region, and the Indians, and the Turks, and even the Germans, Volga Germans, and Trotskyists, and all the Iraqs and Iranians, they used to get together in the certain kolkhoz in Uzbekistan and Tashkent, and they just formed a certain community which is really truly international that Stalin could never ever imagine. And then when the Korean Russian film director Rabindranath made a wonderful film about this community in Central Asia, which is composed of devotees of different ethnicities and nationalities by Stalin, and they just formed a really wonderful international community in the Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, not in Moscow. And then one the Korean film critic just described this as a subaltern cosmopolitanism, and the subaltern. So in this way, I think that also, yes, cosmopolitanism in the 19th century, they always used to be categorized as sort of elitist idea, but on the other hand, internationalism is so much degenerated. So in a sense, we need to also rescue cosmopolitanism from the elitist trend. So I think the subaltern, adjective subaltern, is very much telling, right?
But so many of these communists came from New York, right? And New York, of course, at the turn of the century is this deeply cosmopolitan place. Everybody is traveling through New York, right? And so when they go from New York to Moscow, they're seeing that same milieu. And this is why I'm calling it this transnational space of the communism.
Can you read Roy's writing on Russian Revolution in English?
Yes.
It is published.
He only wrote in English.
Only in
His command of the Indian, he was very young when he left India.
How many books he wrote?
Oh, he took me a long time to do this research. Yeah, he wrote a lot, right?
Only one book you recommend.
The Russian Revolution is a great one, but he has 3 volumes on radical humanism.
It's good.
Yeah, and so he was also so it's very interesting. It's written sort of in this British tradition of writing world history. So he uses it philosophically as a concept, but he shows how it's existed at every stage of world history. It's well worth reading today.
Also, his writings on Chinese Revolution, I think that was really also very important. Really antithesis against the Stalinist conception of Chinese Revolution.
Antithesis.
Anti-Stalinist.
And that's been studied a lot, so it's very interesting. Roy in China has been studied, but this later Roy is like...
this was, I never heard of that.
Because the Indian communists renegade Roy. and he wasn't useful in the Cold War, right? I mean, a guy who critiqued everybody, he was simply not useful, so he became irrelevant for 2 reasons.
One Korean guy in 1960s got in contact with Roy on this front of the radical humanists. His name is who wrote the book on the young Marx and the young Hegelians and the theory of alienation. 정문길, 정문길 told me that. He exchanged the letter with M.N. Roy in 1960.
I think he died in 50s. But maybe in the 50s. Maybe extended in the 50s, right?
How was he? He died, Jeong-Moon-gil?
Yeah, he died. He passed away last
But
year.
how old was he?
He
was born in
32, 34.
32, 34, and 90. Because she said that he was a young student. Actually, he wrote a letter to M.N. Roy, and because he was fascinated by this radical humanism, and then M.N. Roy replied to him.
Because Roy had hooked up with other people in Europe who were also very worried about the Cold War and were trying for a third alternative, right? So he he had an accident and he died, but he was trying to build another way to imagine the world. Right, so there were a lot of people and a lot of intellectuals in Europe who were also, fed up with the Cold War.
point
the
here
US.
is he is a really valuable person to celebrate the 100 years
Oh.
revolution. Very, very smart, cosmopolitan, and aberrational.
Aberrational,
exceptional person.
but also aberrational. So.
I have never heard
Yeah.
about him.
Yeah, because in India, he was such an anti-national. The Indians can't stand him, you know. I mean, speaking truth to power, you're never rewarded, right? So when you choose that path, you must remember it carries a lot of risks.
No.
Nobody really likes you.
No question from our students?
I mean, up until now, was there any other transnational global research on Roy
Well,
other than you?
No, I'm not the first. There are people who've written biographies. So Chris Manjapra at Tufts, he's written a very interesting book where he sees Roy as this global revolutionary. But Chris is trying to prove that, you know, that the Indians came up with globalization before the term, so it's a different kind of approach.
Yeah.
But I think my approach is a little weird because I'm a Russian historian, so I'm not treating him as an Indian. I'm just treating him as somebody who fit into these global conversations. I think my approach is a little different, but people have written about him, for sure. Yeah.
Seja?
This was a really great talk. I just want to ask you kind of sort of big question because I myself is interested in the Cold War in East Asia. So I mean, you sort of implied a lot and, you know, presented in the narrative of how it productizes this kind of traditional Cold War narratives, right? Would it be possible for you to elaborate a little bit more on how it really changes or kind of provide new perspective on the Cold War narrative?
And you know, I mean, and what happens is that historical discourse happens a little later, right? And so it becomes a shorthand, right? So the Cold War is just a very useful way to frame the 20th century. It makes sense, right? There are two superpowers, there's a nice way, there are these two alternative systems, even though during the Cold War in the 1960s, many American economists, including people like Jerry Huff, who was talking about convergence theory, right? They were talking about modernization and saying, hey, it's not that different. They're both building roads and they're both trying to move peasants to the villages. But we now, I think, have a very narrow vision of the Cold War because it's just easy, right? History is dense enough. But I think that, you know, traditionally there was the Cold War and there was the non-aligned movement, right? But all of these are state-centered histories, right? And so I'm trying to think, well, you know, the nation-state is a useful way to organize history. It's a useful way to create identity. But it's not always the best representatives of history. And when people reject national affiliation or think like Kant, there's a categorical imperative should apply to all of humanity, right? Then I think we are attacking the structures of history itself, right? And I think it's overdue. I mean, there are a few books attacking traditional Cold War scholarship, but no one pays any attention to them. These books come out, they get great reviews, but you open history books, it's the same old, right? And so maybe your generation will rewrite that Cold War history. But Erasmus Mandel, have you read his book? That's really good.
Yeah, I'm planning to.
Yeah, Erasmus Mandel,
Yeah.
Dale Kennedy, I think these are some of the people who are doing interesting.
Oh, this is a fascinating story, right? Like this kind of transnational flow
Yeah.
of these people from between like British Empire and
Yeah.
Russia and the Soviet Union, and they had interacted with like Lenin and Stalin and
Yeah.
Trotsky. And so yeah, it sounds really kind of different, provides different angle to these traditional Cold War narratives.
Yeah, actually, historical actors, once they are back to the stage, the stories they are telling is quite different from the structure, right?
Yeah.
It's not structure, but people.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of
Marxism and something like
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
So in a sense, that focus on the individual actors would be very, I mean, that in a sense, quite important to understand the Cold War, for the different lives.
Yeah, because it's interesting that, you know, even Tagore at that time didn't really perceive Russia as like, you know, top poor or like unfree,
Yes.
or this kind of our current notion of the Cold War division is not really present there. So I thought that was really interesting.
And I think there are many of these stories. It's just that they don't fit into any historiography, right? So I mean, how to create an alternative ways of narrating the 20th century.
Judo first time.
Yeah, I know your focus was on Russia, but I was wondering how did they see the United States?
Oh, so Roy, as I said, started off in Berkeley and Stanford, right? So he was in California, and he had an American wife, right? But it's people never look at the United States, right? People usually see the world through their networks, right? So he was very close with the radical American left, and he was very good friends with Bertrand Wolff, right? And then with Jay Lovestone, right? Yeah, and so he fit in with the radical America extremely well, even when he was very against American imperialism or capitalism. Does that make sense? No one reacts to our country. We always see the country through our networks, right? And there were many people like Roy in the United States, till 1919 and the Red Square. America probably had the richest left tradition outside Europe, and every European revolutionary got into trouble. Where did they go? They went to America, right? So in 1919, when they cracked down, it was a real bloodbath. I mean, people are thrown out, people are jailed because the left was so all-pervasive. And I wonder if 1917 hadn't happened in Soviet Union, American history would have been very different. I really believe that. If you look at the decades of the 1890s, 1910s, labor radicalism is at its peak in the United States. And I have a feeling 1917 gave capitalism the moral urgency to crush socialism. Does that make sense? Because it gave it a home. It's very hard to crush a transnational phenomena, but it was easier to contain the Soviet Union. But this is my very revisionist understanding of American history also.
I mean, again, because I'm also a student of Cold War history, and this was just really fascinating in terms of just, and that, again, like just reminding me of the necessity of thinking about these various agents in terms of this exchange and this, and also like the kind of the different way of thinking about this. Because as we just talked about, because we always tend to think in this older narrative, in this two center, not really think from the periphery, but again, this was a really good talk for me in that purpose. And that was just my remark. And just have one really simple question is that so in case of this Roy, it seems like like if I designate this many people who went to maybe some Soviet Union, or I can also think of some Korean nationalists who went to China to learn about these revolutions. Maybe I can designate them into maybe some revolution seekers, maybe.
Yes.
So among these many people, would you say that is Roy's case quite exceptional compared to the other many these people who went to Soviet Union, or maybe some other country to learn about this revolution in terms of because what's really interesting to me is that definitely Roy after. Because he was already designated by Soviet Union as renegade, and compared to many other people who thought that they learned really well from Soviet Union in terms of revolution, but that already tells much about the difference between Roy and the other people. But would you say that his case was really kind of exceptional compared to the others?
Well, I think Emma Goldman was the first, right? So she's an anarchist who goes thrown out of the United States in 1919, and then she goes there, and then 22 she publishes My Disillusionment in Russia, right? There's Angelica Balabanov, right? There's Rosa Luxemburg. There's of course Bertrand Wolff. There's Jay Lovestone. There's this whole American radical tradition. They're also horrified with what's happening. But what's happened in the Cold War is we only look for those names who went from socialism, Stalinism is terrible, therefore capitalism is good, right? So we like the George Orwells, right, who made that switch from one side, right? So we don't have a way to narrate the people who didn't like the Soviet Union but thought about another way of radical equality, right? A third way, and that is the story that I want to tell, that there has to be more than capitalism and socialism, right? There must be another way to imagine another world. Otherwise, the 21st century, now we are down to just one option. And I have a feeling this option is not working very well for everybody.
Those slightly different than Isaac Deutscher
Yes.
can be also another case because he was a member of a KPP, Polish Communist Party in the 1920s. But after having traveled over Russia, he just turned himself into a Trotskyist.
Right.
And then that's why later he
Yeah.
wrote a biography of Trotsky.
3 volumes.
Three volumes.
But the Fourth International is not that different from the Third International, right?
Yeah, in some sense.
It's
yeah.
not
As you said, as Roy said, it's just change, replacement of.
They replace Lenin with, Stalin,
Trotsky,
So I think that's the problem with the organized left, right? It was variations of this story, and a complete suppression of anarchism. I think that's, and it's still amazing to me how that entire tradition was suppressed. I can understand how it was suppressed in the Soviet Union, but in the rest of the world, I mean, that's another global story that needs many, many, many dissertations to unearth, right?
But also, for example, the case of Dunayevskaya.
Yeah,
So the former Trotskyist, but also very close to Emma Goldman.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of some other cases.
Marie
actually.
Bokchin,
And so I mean, for me personally, Dunayevskaya, those guys who are buried in this
Yes.
lifetime cemetery in Chicago.
Right.
These guys are
Yeah.
really interesting group of those.
It's in the US. It's interesting that
Yeah,
anarchism seems to have survived the most in the US. But again, that we're very histories of anarchism in the US.
Okay, other questions or? Yes.
Very simple one. I was very interested in also hearing about the American laborers in the Soviet Union in the beginning of the 1920s. How many people were there?
Over 100,000
Yeah,
in
that
depression.
is very interesting, and I was wondering what kind of trouble they experienced and
Yes.
how it was also recorded in history.
Yeah.
Because we know the radical intellectuals went to the Soviet Union, and many people went there. We know that, but we don't know really the laborers, how they are involved. That is also one very challenging history, the block history.
So the interesting thing is the narratives of the ordinary workers who wound up supporting the Cold War narratives because many of them came back and some of them perished in Stalinist camps. And the few memoirs that were published after 1991, people who stayed just said that their time was terrible. And so many of the workers, strangely enough, the engineers came back very happy with the Soviet Union, because they didn't have labor unions to deal with, right? So it's very interesting. The American engineers and the German engineers like, this is great, so much easier. I want labor, the next day 20,000 people are arrested and they're brought, so they have no problems. But the American workers were much less happy, even though they got 3 times the pay of Russian workers. That wasn't a very happy story. So some of those stories actually reinforce the Cold War narrative.
So they all paid less than
Three
they paid in the US.
But many of them didn't have jobs, right?
Right.
And there was a huge Jewish migration from the US to Birobidzhan. And so from Los Angeles, from Chicago, from Detroit, from New York, there were lots of American Jews who went because Stalin created the first Jewish homeland in Birobidzhan, right? Long before Israel.
1930s?
Yeah, 1930. It was supposed to be in Odessa, but Stalin said, no, let Birobidzhan is safer. So that's another story of internationalism. People came from around the world to build that Jewish homeland.
Even the Korean colonial newspapers reported about this plan, because for the colonial Korean nationalists, this could be a certain news, right? Or those people could establish their own certain autonomous state-like organizations in nowhere, in the middle of nowhere anyway. But there was a great news. There was news.
Maybe it's the interesting to compare the picture of person on the screen. Tagore is very soul searching. On the contrary, Royce is very secular intellectual image. I'd like to know what about Royce's attitude toward his indigenous Indian religious tradition.
So he was very contemptuous, as you can imagine. He's an atheist, right? And he thinks Tagore represents everything that's wrong with India. But by the end of his life, he was coming around to, and I was very surprised that this, Tagore's notion of anti-authoritarianism has to be at an individual level, right? It can't, and that, structural analysis can only take us so far, but you come back to the notion of our ethical response. So I found that interesting, but he's so rude about Tagore, right? But he's changing his mind, and Tagore never even talks about Roy. It's like he doesn't exist, but Roy is very critical of Tagore.
And did you find any remarks about the racial inequality in their travel up to Russia, Soviet Union, and the United States, and their sensibility about racism and something like that?
So Tagore, he makes the comparison between the Indian caste system and race in the United States, right? And so he says, that every human society is divided, and the Indians do it hideously, but when he goes to the United States, he's shocked by racism, right? Roy doesn't write about race because as a Marxist, it's not a category he's very comfortable with, right? And I think he just sort of avoids writing about what divides us. But I also think he was arrogant enough to think race didn't matter. Right? He was very smart, and I think very smart people don't think about race and ethnicity, right? Because they just think it's something to hide behind.
Just like as Rosa Roosevelt never thought about gender.
Never thought about gender, right?
Okay. Let's leave it to Clara Zetkin. I would do revolution.
Because Zetkin wasn't very bright. She was, Luxembourg was a brilliant woman, right?
This is Clara Zetkin.
Yeah, it's the same thing, right?
Yes, please.
It might be very interesting if we can know whether there is any uniquely Indian way of thinking in these two aberrational revolutions.
That's a great question. I mean, Tagore would say the only unique thing about India is that it's been colonized by so many different people that it's a mongrel civilization. And so when he creates his university, the slogan is "the world in a home," right? And so his cosmopolitanism was from below. That this is a place where many people have come, races have commingled, and his definition of patriotism was if you leave the land better than when you found it. And if you really love the ecology, that to him was patriotism. So I don't know if that's Indian, but he thought it was. He thought he was drawing on Indian. That's what he learned from Indian history, is this radical equality and environmentalism. And Roy would utterly reject your question of uniquely Indian. He didn't believe in national characteristics. He thought that was something that was made up. He really didn't believe in it.
Are there any questions?
Any further goals? So are you trying to build up a new genealogy of the third wave on a view towards Cold War?
I'm trying to finish this book where I'm looking at, if you include Russia into the 20th century, then you have a different way of telling the story, right? And so each chapter I'm taking up a separate theme to do it. But it's very hard, I mean, to master more than 2 or 3 historiographies. It's very difficult. So, but I really recommend that students start with a home. When you have a home, my home is Russia in the United States, Slavic studies in the United States, and then it allows me to roam. But I don't know how people are trained in comparative history because because I knew Russian history, I could learn American history. Because I learned American history, I could go to Indian and British history. But I don't know how to structure a graduate program in comparative history because I don't know what that training would look like.
Yeah.
No, anywhere,
Yeah, but
because
in a sense, but Choi, the comparative history, in a sense, presupposes a certain dichotomy of the universal and particular, right?
Right.
Or usually, very often in the comparative history frame, the so-called the West
Right.
is located as the universal
Right.
to which the particular histories are related.
Right.
So in a sense, that's why I just like to emphasize certain shift from comparative history to transnational history,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And also comparative history is sort of shift from comparison to connection, connectedness, or shift from transport to interaction.
Right.
These sort of things, in a sense, tells us a fundamental difference between comparative history and the transnational
history.
In a sense, all national history is comparative history. Because, our national case studies, right? It's always presupposes certain comparison.
Yeah.
So comparative history has been always a very close pair of national history,
Yeah.
right? And national history has never ever been national. It has been always, comparative and transnational, international.
Yeah.
So I mean that this makes a bit different, I think.
Yeah, but it's just that we need some new narratives.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
And I think that's what I'm looking for. And I think your generation will write those histories. You all are much more, because of social media and travel, you all are much more global-minded than
Yeah, sure,
my generation.
In their age, it was never allowed for me to go abroad.
Yeah,
I didn't have a passport.
Yeah,
I was just drinking Korean schnapps. That's the only thing I could do in their age. But now, these guys.
they have a huge advantage over
Yes,
us.
of course, of
And
course.
they all
And
see
their
people.
language, foreign language, English, and my generation.
That's why I said about unlearning everything from graduate school.
That's why we have wines over there.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.